Hello, hello. It is wonderful to see you all tonight, albeit virtually. Hundreds of people are here with us. Thank you so much for joining us, for your support, for your belief in BUR. Our journalism is powered by all of you. And for those of you I haven't had the pleasure of meeting, I'm Margaret Lowe, the CEO of WBUR, and here we are 2 weeks after the election. Joe Biden is the president-elect, having won 306 electoral votes to President Trump's 232 electoral votes. Nearly 79 million Americans cast their ballot for the former vice president, who also won the popular vote by more than 5.5 million people. But as we know, President Trump has not conceded the election. He continues to fuel unsubstantiated claims of election fraud, and no formal transition is underway. We are at an inflection point. America is deeply divided in the grips of a pandemic. The number of COVID cases is soaring. The economy is in a perilous state, and the loss of jobs is shattering millions of people's lives. So what a year this has been, and what a moment this is. NPR and WBUR have been doubling down on these intersecting stories with coverage that has range, sophistication, and depth. And like all of us, our journalists are asking, now what? That's the question we're posing tonight, and we are ever so lucky to have some of our top political journalists here to help us make sense of the 2020 election and to talk about what lies ahead in the weeks and months to come. We promise we're going to leave time for your questions along the way. My thanks to the Boston Foundation for making this gathering possible. There is so much territory to cover, so let's get rolling. With that, it gives me great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Tonya Mosley, the host of Here and Now, which is a co-production of NPR and WBUR. Tonya, I'm going to leave it to you to introduce our NPR colleagues, and the floor is now yours. Tonya.
Thank you so much, Margaret. I've been looking forward to this conversation with, as you said, the top NPR political reporters who have been giving us the information that we need for the last year, and we're finally here. I want to say a few things to the audience. We're streaming live from the WBUR CitySpace YouTube channel, so you can subscribe to the channel to be notified whenever we go live, and you can find more information about all of our programming at wbur.org/CitySpace. Also, we want you, the audience, to be part of this conversation with us. You can do so by submitting your questions at slido.com. That's SLIDO.com. Using the event code WBUR Town Hall, all one word, lowercase, and we will do our best to get to as many questions as possible. All right, what you all have been waiting for. Let me introduce you to our panelists. We have Asma Khalid. She's a political correspondent for NPR and co-host of the NPR Politics Podcast. And she's been on the road and embedded with the Biden campaign this entire year, covering the 2020 presidential election. And of course, she is no stranger to WBUR. Before heading to DC, she was a correspondent here. Welcome back, Asma.
My pleasure. Thank you all for having me.
Yes, and we have Tamara Keith. She's an NPR White House correspondent and fellow co-host of the NPR Politics Podcast. And she's been covering the Trump administration for the last 4 years, helping us keep track of and contextualize this presidency. And before that, Tam covered the last 2 years of the Obama White House and also reported on Congress with a specific focus on House Republicans. Welcome, Tam.
Glad to be here.
And last but not least, we have Ron Elving. He's a senior editor and correspondent for NPR's Washington Desk, and he's been working and or covering Washington politics since he first arrived in D.C. in 1984 as a congressional fellow with the American Political Science Association. And I actually think it's fair to say that Ron feels like NPR's trusted insider on all things Washington politics. Whenever I have you on Here and Now, Ron, I always think, oh, okay, we are going to get the real, measured, honest, and authoritative look at what's happening. So welcome to you all.
Good to be with you, Tonya.
Yes. So as we heard Margaret say, President-elect Joe Biden won the election and will be the president of the United States. But that is far from the end of the story. I mean, it's just the beginning. We're on the cusp of a new administration and a surge of COVID-19 cases. And the last 4 years has reshifted the trajectory of the United States, both politically and culturally. Many of the institutions that for so long seemed unwavering are now being questioned. And really, as Americans, we are divided and no longer really share a common agreement on what's actually true or factual. We're in the midst of what I always like to call thick history. So today we'll be taking on the big question, what's next? And we'll be answering your questions. So let's start with this big one, the transition of power. I recently read that democracy is founded on the idea of good losers. In other words, in order to transition power, those who lose elections must not just cede power, but participate in that transition. And that's not what's happening right now. Trump's campaign has filed several lawsuits, most of which have been thrown out by the courts. I'll start with you, Tamara. What are the legal challenges and really what's the strategy here for the Trump administration now that Biden is so clearly the winner?
So let's be clear that many inside the Trump White House, maybe all, I haven't talked to all of them, but there's a sense that this is not going to change the outcome, that these legal challenges are simply doing what the president has to do either for himself or for his base, sort of running all the options, seeing it through to its conclusion. But I have been told not to expect a concession speech, not to expect any sort of handshake or formal handoff in a ceremonial sense. Because essentially what President Trump is doing with these lawsuits is trying to create a scenario where he can claim that it was stolen from him, or he didn't really lose, or that, yes, Joe Biden is becoming president, but it was stolen from me because of any number of completely false claims about vote rigging. And I mean, like, every day there are multiple tweets that are completely fact check untrue, making claims about our election system. But so that seems to be the end game, is that at some point, and we don't know what it is, the transition will be allowed to begin, but don't expect President Trump to welcome it with open arms or even acknowledge that it's happening.
The transition of power, though, is a really important step because there's so much that needs to happen, and it needs to happen now, right? I mean, typically, this is when all of these things will be happening 2 months before, a few months before January 20th is not a long time.
No, and Asma and I were both on this call today that the Biden transition COVID advisors had, and they were talking about very specific things that they need that they can't get, like access to real-time data. I mean, right now, the president-elect's advisors are relying on the same COVID dashboards that we're all checking obsessively as regular citizens. And that is really problematic. And that's just one area. Of course, today, Asma, the president-elect met with national security advisors who are not part of the government because he can't meet with government national security advisors.
Asma, I want to talk to you a little bit more about the Biden transition team. But first, I want to bring in a few questions from the audience for Ron about this transition of power. We have someone who's asking, if President Trump refuses to leave the White House, are there any legal options to extricate him?
There is one simple legal option, which is that you inform him he is no longer welcome in the building, and he can literally be escorted out at that juncture. That is certainly not something that we anticipate. I don't mean to create an expectation that you're going to see some sort of physical confrontation. I do not believe that's what Donald Trump is planning. Donald Trump may push it to the brink of that. In many respects, that would fit the overall scenario, and I think using a theatrical term like scenario is appropriate. The president is setting up a scenario in which he will be three things: past, present, and future. He will be your president in the past, your martyr in the present, and your president again in the future. Now, whether he runs again in 2024, we will speculate about for some time to come. We don't know. But he can hold that open as a possibility. So how does he make the transition into that scenario most effectively? Probably by holding out as long as possible. I agree with Tam. I agree with Martin Gelman, who wrote that wonderful Atlantic piece a couple of months ago. I'm sure many people on this call have read. The president probably will never concede. You probably never concede. And that is, it's not totally unprecedented. We had some people who didn't go to the inauguration of their successor. Both John Adams and his son, John Quincy Adams, did not do that. But in the period of time that we all remember, even me, that's, not done.
Sure.
The president always gets the acknowledgement of his predecessor at the inauguration. So this is kind of outrageous territory, but it all fits in with this apparent creation of this new scenario for the persona of Donald Trump post-presidency.
Yeah, it's unknown territory. We've never experienced this in our lifetimes. I would love for you to give us a little bit more context, though, overall on all of the things we're seeing happening in real time. Last week, as we all know, President Trump fired Defense Secretary Mark Esper, which really caused ripples across the organization, with one defense official telling CNN that this shakeup is akin to a dictatorship. I mean, Ron, you've covered several transitions of power. This is unprecedented, but what do these changes in the Defense Department actually mean for the incoming Biden-Harris administration?
Two ways to look at the firing of Mark Esper. One was the president had been making it clear he was unhappy with Esper ever since June and their conflict over whether or not active troops should be used to suppress demonstrations in Washington, D.C. The president wanted to have free use of the armed services to clear protesters away, and Mark Esper objected to that, along with the Joint Chiefs of Staff and many other military people, uniformed and non-uniformed. Since then, it's been clear that the president was just waiting for the moment that he could bring the hammer down on Mark Esper. I mean, maybe that's putting it a little too strongly, but it was not a surprise that he was unhappy with him. However, there's another way of looking at it as well, which is far more chilling, which was that he was installing three people at the top of the policymaking structure at the Pentagon who were very young, very inexperienced, total Trump, and total, well, let us say, people who had said things and written things in the past that were disturbing. Mm-hmm. As a result, some people began to get the sense, the feeling, that the president was planning to, in some sense or another, assert a claim on the military in the 10 weeks after the election if things were going against him and if he felt he was somehow being done dirty. And we know he may feel that way, but look, this isn't a close call. I don't anticipate there being anything of this nature from him. I'm just saying there was a chill at the replacement of the Secretary of Defense if you believed that Donald Trump was capable of trying to use the military to stay in power. I don't believe that. I don't think there's any sympathy for that in the military. And I don't think that even this crew of very new people that he's put in at the Pentagon would be able to effectuate that. But that's why people took that Esper firing with a certain chill.
I have quite a few questions on this thread for you, Ron, but I want to bring Asma in and we'll come back to this topic. Asma, you've been covering the Biden-Harris transition team. As we heard, you've been on quite a few calls. Already, they're setting the tone with what we can actually expect from this administration. 46% of the transition team, I think, is people of color and 52% women. How do you think this makeup will take on COVID-19 in ways that address the racial and gender inequities that have been laid bare by this pandemic?
Well, this is certainly something that the Biden campaign and the Biden transition folks are touting, right? They've tried to emphasize the fact that they were trying to create an administration that looks like America. The COVID task force that he's assembled as well, I can't recall the exact statistics offhand, but there are a number of advisors that he has that are from different backgrounds, folks of color. And they have, emphasized this point repeatedly. We're hearing some of that even when we look at, sort of how he's thinking about the economy and treasury picks, of highlighting issues around racial inequity. I will say, though, Tonya, I think one challenge for Joe Biden and this incoming administration is he built an extraordinarily broad tent. And so there has already become, I would say, a lot of jockeying for power amongst different coalitions, calling for specific asks that just aren't realistically sustainable. And one example is, I got an email the other week from the National Association of Latino Elected Officials asking for 5 cabinet members to be Latino, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that is going to realistically happen within Joe Biden's administration. We had emails today from a number of progressive organizations who felt like they had helped push Biden over the edge and ultimately were not happy with some of the senior staff appointments. These are, organizations like the Sunrise Movement, which is largely young people, climate-oriented activists. So, I often have said I thought Joe Biden built a very broad coalition of voters who were largely united by one common foe, who was Donald Trump. And it is much harder to govern with such a disparate coalition. And I think we're already beginning to see that with a lot of different constituencies and a lot of different demographic groups having interest in wanting, clearly, not only just a seat at the table, but wanting certain agenda items as well.
Sure. I mean, this has been what was talked about when Biden was considered a front runner, and some of the other candidates who, some of the more progressive or farther left leaning folks really wanted more progressive folks who would take on what they felt were their agenda items or have cabinet positions for them.
Yeah, you're right. And one of the challenges, I think also for Biden is that he will potentially be working with a Republican-controlled Senate. So the idea of having particularly progressive cabinet picks just may not be a feasible reality for him. On top of that, some folks you talk to who've known Joe Biden for a long time also will say that, yes, he will push a progressive agenda, but by nature, Biden is somebody who really does want to unify the country, who does lean towards a sort of bipartisan, centrist, balanced approach. And we can anticipate seeing some more of that in some of the picks that he will have as well.
I have a question for you from an audience member. Let me bring over my screen here so I can see them. Okay, so an audience question from Alex for you, Asma, is, do you think Biden would have chosen Senators Warren or Sanders for a cabinet position if the Democrats had won more Senate seats, or unlikely either way?
Oh gosh, that's such a hypothetical. Okay, so
I know it is.
Candidly, I think a Senator Sanders seat in a Joe Biden cabinet would have been a hard sell regardless of how much Democratic control there was in the Senate. I have been told by people who are close to Biden and Warren that they have developed an appreciation for one another. They do respect one another's, opinions. They talked fairly regularly, is my understanding, throughout the general election cycle. That all being said, I had a conversation with someone today who I thought made a really interesting point. He felt like, in general, the idea that personnel is policy, he thinks will matter less in this White House than in previous administrations. And I sort of questioned him. I said, well, what do you mean?
What do you mean? Yeah.
And he said a couple of things. One is he feels very much like, specifically on economic policy, there will be a balanced approach. And so regardless of whether or not you look at an individual and you think, well, this person is progressive or more moderate, he thinks it will be a balanced approach because that's who he thinks Joe Biden is. But secondly, he also said, if you look at some of the senior staff appointments and some of the additional senior staff appointments we'll likely see in the coming weeks, these folks are very competent and they have expertise on economic issues or public health issues. And case in point, you mentioned is Ron Klain, who Joe Biden chose as his chief of staff. Ron Klain was instrumental in the 2009 Recovery Act. And so you end up having a very White House centric team, and maybe don't need to rely as much on some of the, say, Council of Economic Advisors that a previous administration.
A balanced approach, but clearly COVID-19 and the economic fallout are at the top of the Biden agenda. We still don't have a stimulus package. I mean, what challenges do the Biden-Harris camp actually face? What exactly are they centering for their first 100 days in office?
Oh gosh, I mean, they're centering a lot. I mean, I think the stimulus package is a really interesting one. I'm actually working on a story around this because, again, one person I talked to today mentioned this point that in some ways he feels like it might be politically advantageous for Democrats to agree to a smaller package during a lame duck session, because then it is not Joe Biden's responsibility. And he could say that my undertaking. He also feels like people are hurting right now. And if you wait till January, February for some sort of COVID relief bill. Frankly, that just may be too late for some people. Biden has consistently said he thinks some sort of stimulus relief package needs to occur as quickly as possible, but we don't have a clear sense of what, if anything, he has been doing behind the scenes to push for some sort of bipartisan solution. My colleague Scott Detrow did do some reporting recently, though, looking at just the sheer number of promises that Biden made during the campaign cycle for things that he says he will do on day one or within his first 100 days. And a number of those things could be achieved through executive action. For example, like re-entering the Paris Climate Accord or renewing DACA for folks who came here who are not documented as children. So there are a number of things that he has said he could do through executive action. There are other things, though, like the promise that Biden made that he would have a comprehensive immigration bill sent out to Congress on day one. That, frankly, I think is a lot more difficult proposition when you've got potentially a Republican-controlled Senate. That just doesn't seem as realistic.
I want to bring Tam back in because there's a lot to talk about still regarding the Trump administration. I have several questions. One from Patty, who wants to ask, Trump survived an impeachment by denying and lying. Trump's propaganda initiative split America. How can future presidents be held accountable after Trump? This is a very interesting question.
Yes. And I think that one question might be, and I think Ron may have thoughts on this too, but what I have wondered is during the Trump administration, there are so many things that were previously just norms, like the norm that a president of the United States as a candidate would release their tax returns or release their taxes once they became president. That there were any number of things that President Trump did that completely and totally violated all norms. Oh, for instance, like, putting his finger on the scales with the Justice Department, or pardoning people who he had personal connections to well before the lame duck period at the very end of his presidency, when you would do something controversial and then people would be mad at you for it. He just did so many things that you're not supposed to do and just sort of dared America to do something about it. And I think that the election result was not a complete and total repudiation of Trump in a way that many on the left would have hoped. You didn't end up with the House majority growing. You didn't end up with a Democratic Senate. I mean, you may end up with a very narrowly Democratic Senate if something happens in these Georgia runoffs. But I think that if you had a strong Democratic majority in the House and Senate, you probably would have seen some bills sail through the House and Senate that made those norms into laws, just as they did after Nixon. But I don't know what happens now. And I would, Ron, who has a better grasp on history than I do, I always like to hear Ron's thoughts on these sort of things.
Yeah, Ron, your thoughts.
First of all, I would say that one of the things that Americans continue to like about Donald Trump, and we should say, and here's a statistic you're going to hear from Donald Trump for as long as you hear anything from Donald Trump, he got more votes in this election than any sitting president has ever received. Not a higher percentage. That's to his grief. He was sub 50%. He got about 47, and it's going to round down, I think, to around 47 right now. It's about 47.3%. Mitt Romney got 47%, and Donald Trump has never stopped calling him a loser. But in Donald Trump's case, he will always remind you that he got more votes than any other sitting president. Why do so many Americans still really like Donald Trump? One of the reasons I think they do is because he doesn't care about all those norms. He doesn't care about all the things that those of us who have made our lives in Washington, D.C., even, it only takes 5 or 10 years before you sort of become a Washington, D.C. swamp creature. If you really care about those things, you are almost automatically detaching yourself from the essential emotional feelings of most Americans. Most Americans have more of a feeling of hostility towards Washington than anything else. And we've seen candidates, certainly back to Ronald Reagan, and even in his own way, Jimmy Carter, run against Washington. It's really become almost a cliche. And I remember being shocked when Bill Clinton got away with being basically a womanizer and a draft dodger. And we knew that before the first primary in 1992, and people still voted for him. So norm busting has actually been around for a little longer maybe than some Trump critics would say or want to think. And I think we have to see norm busting as being an inhibitor of governing. Certainly it was an inhibitor of Donald Trump's effectiveness as president, but it was also a major connection to the feelings of American voters.
Does this same idea of running against Washington play out for lawmakers in Congress? I mean, thinking about the Georgia runoff, we actually have a question from someone watching who says, why did the Republicans outperform Democratic candidates in congressional elections?
Well, I would argue that one reason is that they had the opportunity to vote against Donald Trump. So in the suburbs where Donald Trump did very poorly and where his name was mud and where all of his norm busting and crude speaking and all of that was not well received. In the suburbs, they could vote for Joe Biden, and then they could vote for a Republican congressman. And you know, I think that there was some sense based on the polls that, you know, if you were voting for a Republican down ballot, you were voting to put a check on Joe Biden because you knew Joe Biden was going to win.
Ron, your thoughts on this?
Yeah.
Well, I would like to say about the down ballot performance, and the Senate is one thing where I think just about everybody was shocked at how well Susan Collins did, running so far ahead of Trump in Maine. And to some degree, the same would be said of Tom Tillis, although North Carolina wound up still voting for Trump. And I suspect that Tillis was better off in his reelection being linked to Trump. So the Senate tends to be, each race is a little bit its own creature. In the House, you do see more of a pattern. And I think it's very important to say this about the Republican recruiting efforts for 2020. They went out there and found people to run for House seats, especially to challenge sitting Democrats. And every seat that they flipped, not necessarily every seat they won, because they won some very traditionally Republican seats, but every seat that they flipped from Democrat to Republican was won by a person who was either a woman, a person of color, or a veteran of the military, or some combination of those three, more than one of those three things. And that is exactly the playbook that the Democrats used in flipping the House in their direction in 2018. Women candidates, people of color, and women and people of color are now the majority of the Democratic caucus in the House, and veterans. Some people were all three. Some people were 2 out of 3. That was potent for the Democrats in 2018, and let's give the Republicans credit. They were paying attention.
Let's talk about a little bit about, there's so much here, by the way, so I'm trying to measure how many questions I can ask you from the audience. Let's talk a little bit about the future of getting things done in Washington. We have a question from Allison who asks, what steps can be taken to eliminate partisan obstructionism, paralysis in Congress, so parties are compelled to work together in the interest of the people? I'll start with you, Ron.
I wish I could say that there were steps that could be taken to do that. I'm sorry, did you say Ron?
Yes. I did. Yes.
I wish I could say that there were steps that I can clearly see that could be taken that would make a big difference. Unfortunately, I think it's going to take a larger attitudinal change, and what professional politicians see is what wins. And what wins at this point is polarization. Being the most Republican person in your district, the most Republican candidate in your district or in your state, that's how you win the primary. And then you bash the other party. And this goes in both directions. It's a totally bipartisan phenomenon. Too many of our districts and states are won by the person who is most, I won't necessarily say extreme, but the person who's most distinctly either a left or right candidate in the primary, and then that person bashes the other side in the election. And what brings you to Washington is what influences the way you behave once you get here.
I mean, don't you think, though, Ron, that there's also not really an incentive towards increased compromise. I mean, we live in extremely isolated zip codes. I mean, when I was doing my demographics reporting during the 2016 cycle, the joke, but it's not really a joke, is that you could often determine the way that a person would vote based on looking at their zip code, where they lived, certain demographic characteristics about them. And it's not, it's not a rule book. It's not always accurate, but it's pretty indicative of that. And it feels like that's become even more true after 2020. If we look at where Democrats really won, where did they win? They won in urban environments. And, I was struck by the fact that when you look at 2020's results, it felt like the areas of the country that are blue got bluer, and the areas of the country that were red got redder. So I am not particularly optimistic at all about the idea of there being, an increase towards compromise and bipartisanship, because it doesn't feel like there's any incentive to do that, nor do I think that the way our current maps are structured encourages politicians to do that either, because the way they're going to win re-election is to go home to those districts and win in places that are fairly politically homogenous.
Let me add a slight, tiny, maybe possible optimistic thing.
Bring it, Tam. Bring it.
Will not turn through.
Bring it.
We are a country in the middle of a really bad crisis right now. People are dying, like 1,000 people a day are dying. The numbers are going to get worse. These are real people who are loved by dozens of others, each and every single one of them. And there is a great American mourning that is going to need to happen. And there could be a coming together around that, an ability to see the humanity in others that we haven't been able to see because of the internet. It's possible. Or it's possible that we'll all just continue throwing bombs from our, channels our bubbles where we live.
Well, Allison's question, though, really gets at this larger issue regarding the efficacy of our democratic institutions. I mean, that toll extends also beyond our national borders to the international community. I mean, historically, the United States has seen itself as promoting democracy around the world and as an economic leader. How have the last 4 years changed the international role of the U.S., especially in terms of our diplomatic and economic relations with China, for example? Tam, I'll have you start.
Yeah, so, I mean, President Trump came in with an America First approach. He continued with his America First approach, and that meant pulling out of international treaties. It meant treating longtime, really important American allies worse than countries that aren't necessarily American allies, or countries that we've traditionally had a tenuous or challenging relationship with. He treated those leaders better than he treated Angela Merkel, for example. And with China, certainly, first he was really working to befriend China to try to get a trade deal. And then, there was a lot of fighting back and forth and a lot of tariffs. And I think if Asma didn't say this already, Biden's going to roll back those tariffs. It's wildly unlikely that he would keep those in place because, as we've heard from Kai Ryssdal a million times, tariffs are just taxes on us, on American consumers. So, I think that he, by pulling out of things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal, President Trump sort of changed the way the world sees America, changed the way the world sees the reliability of America, and also created a bit of a vacuum for China and Russia. And I don't know that a different president is just going to snap that back into place. I don't necessarily think that it will. I think that the concern internationally is something to the effect of, okay, so every 4 years, policy is going to completely and totally change. Like that, because traditionally there had been an agreement between Democrats and Republicans that, America leads the world. And President Trump's approach to leading the world was vastly, vastly different.
Well, Asma, I want to bring you in here. I mean, Tam brought up the Biden-Harris administration, and one of the things that Biden talks about is tariffs and rolling that back. But they haven't released any formal policy, right, on how they hope to interact specifically with China.
No, they haven't. And, he was actually asked about entering into specifically a new trade agreement just earlier this week. And he was very coy in saying that, he's not really wanting to delve into the details of anything around specific trade deals that he would enter, in part because those trade deals, the specific one was being currently negotiated. But look, I think that the other thing to me that's very interesting is over the 4 years that Trump has been in office, he has certainly accentuated the focus on buying in American goods, making American goods. And so throughout the campaign cycle, we actually heard an economic agenda from Joe Biden that in some ways was far more nationalist than the Democratic economic agenda that you might have heard from Barack Obama, for example. Joe Biden had a specific policy that was, and it is, to buy American. He's touting that just this week at his economic agenda platform. And so I was talking with a couple of people who are involved with trade, and they said in some ways they actually feel like certain, visions around trade may be different, but there are certain elements of U.S. trade policy that, for example, on USMCA, which is the trade deal that was negotiated with Canada and Mexico, did receive a decent amount of Democratic support. Some folks will say they don't feel like it was substantially different than NAFTA, but that being said, there were some differences, and by and large, a good number of Democrats did support. And so I will say, I think that Donald Trump has changed the overall tone on issues of trade in a way that it has now become politically expedient for some Democrats to focus on domestic manufacturing in a way that was perhaps not as commonplace.
Interesting. Ron, do you have anything to say about this?
Just that there are two very different political calculations here. One is that Joe Biden ought to get a huge break, more so than any American president, perhaps, in a very long time, even more so, perhaps, than Barack Obama got from the international community, because they're just going to be so relieved to have him and not Trump. Now, there was some of that for Obama. Remember, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize before he'd actually even been president. And that was largely a slap at George W. Bush, and I think we got that at the time. But there's going to be a big opportunity here for Joe Biden to say, work with me, folks. We want to bring America back into the world. We want to bring America back to a leadership role, but a leadership role in a positive sense. And we really want to put behind us this brief interlude, this bad memory of 4 years. We won't even mention any names. That's one political calculation that ought to work in Joe Biden's favor. The other political calculation is that the parties are still very much at war over the working class voter who does not feel that the working class voter got a good representation in the trade deals of the last 20, 30 years. And that was a big of Donald Trump's appeal in 2016, especially in blue collar communities. I'm tempted to say in the Midwest and in the Great Lakes, but I think it's a big part of his appeal everywhere that he did well.
Yep. Turning back to more domestic concerns, but keeping with this idea of changing institutions, we actually have a question from an audience member, Jay, who says both parties face major challenges to their identity and efficacy. What are your recommendations for those who are deeply concerned about their party? Tamara and Asma, I'd love for you all to reflect on that. For both the Republicans and the Democrats, what does it even mean to identify with the party, and what are major tensions that both parties are having to address? And I'll start with you, Tam.
Yeah. In answering the question about what people should do about discomfort with where their party is headed, I think part of the answer that I often think about with American politics is just that people would be much better served spending more time thinking locally than focusing on national politics and, focusing on the hot Senate race or, spending all your time worrying about the president. You can make a much bigger difference. And if you're worried about your party, you can change your party from the ground up by getting, involved in, focusing more locally. You can make a bigger difference in your life and your community by focusing locally. But in terms of the parties more broadly and the challenges they face, for the Republican Party, Donald Trump casts a really large shadow, and there are a bunch of people who are making trips to Iowa and New Hampshire for the last couple of months, campaigning for President Trump, who are going to be in a total purgatory mode if the biggest name in the Republican Party, the one who has all of the small donors, the big guy who gets all the attention, if he's still talking about running for president or otherwise putting his finger on the scales or blocking the sun for them, whatever great reckoning about who the Republican Party isn't going to be able to happen if Donald Trump, who turned it into his party, is still the guy.
Yeah. Do you see any rising stars?
There are tons of rising stars.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's tons of people who think that they are rising stars also.
Right. Yes. I'm sure that's true, but
so maybe I should not name all the names after saying that sentence.
Yeah,
but
you'll be getting
there are many people who were making trips to Iowa and New Hampshire who clearly, like you, don't spend that much time in Iowa and New Hampshire unless you think you're running for president. And it's Senator Tom Cotton and South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem, who has been running ads on TV about how great her state is. Please come visit, and getting her name ID up all over America with tourism funds. And you have, I think Ted Cruz is still in the mix, certainly. Mike Pence would like his name to be at the top of the list, the vice president. There are a lot of people, Ron DeSantis, the Florida governor, somebody described him to me as he's like Trump, but more disciplined. Nikki Haley.
Nikki Haley.
And so, I was talking to somebody who was involved in Trump's campaign early on in 2016, who really channels Trumpism. And he said, Trump is lost, but, we're coming back in 2022 and we're coming back in 2024. And there's all kinds of people ready to carry the mantle.
Interesting. You said you weren't going to do a list, but you did a little list there. But those are the ones that we all know. You're right. I mean, I want to bring you, though, in Asma, asking the same question. What are the major tensions that Democrats will have to address? And within the party, there are centrists and progressive factions. What's the future?
I would say that tension is not going to be able to be delayed until 2024, maybe, as it might be for Republicans. That tension is already spilling out, as I mentioned, just with who Joe Biden is selecting for senior staff, who's pointing fingers about why some of those House seats were lost, for example. We saw that spill out in very public view, where some members of the House felt like it was because of rhetoric around defunding the police. In fact, I just had a conversation today with a woman who leads a sort of fairly large network of Black and brown organizations that were very active in places like Arizona, in Michigan and Wisconsin. And they feel like part of why Joe Biden won some of those states is because of the on-the-ground grassroots organizing that they have done for a state like Arizona, frankly, decades. And they feel like the Democratic Party hasn't always invested in places like Arizona and Georgia as much. And I think there's some veracity to that. That all being said, though, on this issue, for example, of defunding the police, I mean, that's already come up in some of my conversations. I think that there is a difference of opinion that is largely falling along both, I think, age divides as well as some, and this is not exclusively, some divides along race. I would say that I think the age divide to me is a sort of clear delineation, because I think we're hearing some of the spillover and the frustration with where Joe Biden has made some of his initial picks from younger folks who are involved in the climate movement, right? Or younger folks who wanted specific things. And they feel like on their behalf, they showed up, look, young voters were very skeptical of Hillary Clinton. There were a lot of voters of color in different communities who were very skeptical of Hillary Clinton. They organized en masse for Joe Biden this cycle. I think one of the interesting things right now is everybody's looking around and trying to understand how Joe Biden won. And some folks point to suburban women and, outside of Philadelphia. Other people will say, no, it was young progressives in Arizona. But everybody is trying to take credit for this. And I think that speaks to the divides within the Democratic Party. We saw, I think, very publicly in some comments that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the congresswoman from New York, made, where, she feels like she played ball. But I do think there is a frustration amongst some younger members of the House who are more progressive, who don't feel like their ideas are, necessarily represented by the sort of mainstream of the party. I think what's happening on the Democratic side, to me, is fascinating. I also think, though, that how Joe Biden navigates this will be equally fascinating. And to me, one of the biggest, earliest tests will be on something like immigration. I mean, the party is so far left on immigration than where it was in, say, the 1990s. And there are immigration activists who are unhappy with, say, where Barack Obama was.
Absolutely, yeah.
And they're being very vocal about that. And I don't know that, sort of executive actions only are going to be sufficient to some of those activists. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens.
To your point about being divided regarding issues like police reform, is it fair to say, though, Asma, that there's not even a consensus on what folks are saying when they say police reform? I mean, even within the progressives versus the more centrist.
That's true. I mean, I actually took this question at some point during my reporting this summer to a number of suburban voters. I think I must have been in Wisconsin or Michigan, somewhere out in the Midwest. I was struck by the fact that there were so many voters in sort of suburban communities who told me that they felt like they didn't really understand what defund the police meant. But then they'd had, a younger, these were sort of like women in their 50s and 60s, but they were like, but my son explained it means reallocating some of the money towards mental health. And so now I think it's a good idea, right? Like, I just think that there was a lot of confusion over what certain terms meant and how much buy-in there was. But, I do think that this is a conversation that is not going to go away within the Democratic Party, in part because the base of the Democratic Party is built now. The current base, I should say, that Joe Biden won on, is built by very, very disparate, constituencies with different interests.
Ron, I have a question for you from Bruce. He asks, how will NPR handle giving Trump coverage after Biden is sworn into office? I think about this every day.
I am grateful to say that I no longer go to meetings and I am no longer a manager. And I spend a lot of my time teaching now, and I can talk to my students in very theoretical terms. That is a real question. What attention are you going to pay to someone who clearly is going to have an audience after office? And unlike previous presidents who also could have had a very large audience after leaving office, and that would include Barack Obama, obviously, Donald Trump is not likely to step back and say, no, there's a new president and I'm not your president anymore. And I will comment when I'm really, 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 really ready and really, really forced to, but I'm going to be highly reticent about it. That would not be our current president and future former president. So we'll see.
Yeah,
we'll
I would say.
I do think it's going to be a tough question for all news organizations. And the reason is the same as the tough question we had in 2016. How much do you cover someone who clearly has a grip on the fears and or aspirations of so much of the country, and much of the country is just flat out addicted to? I saw John Harris at Politico wrote a wonderful piece today with the headline, Keith Richards has advice to you on how to kick your Donald Trump addiction. And Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones had a certain reputation for knowing something about addiction. So I'm planning to read that article with real interest.
Tam, you wanted to jump in here.
Yeah, I was just going to say that part of the reason that every time Barack Obama speaks, it's a big deal is because he doesn't speak very often. And there could be a limit to the public's appetite for Trump content when Trump isn't the president. Now, there was a limit to the, but it was not a large limit. It was not a low limit. There was a lot of appetite for Trump birtherism content for years.
Sure.
So, but it wasn't widespread appetite. A lot of people could very easily ignore it. It's a lot harder to ignore, for instance, the tweets when they are coming from the President of the United States, and you don't know whether that tweet is actually enacting policy or whether it's a dude watching TV. But when he is no longer president, he is maybe a potential candidate, but he's definitely just a dude watching TV when he tweets about policy, which will make the 5-alarm fire for every Trump tweet go away.
But I will say, Tonya, though, regardless of whether or not we as a network cover Donald Trump, to me that feels like the secondary question in a mission that I have been very, very sort of strongly advocating in the network, which is that, to Ron's earlier point, 70+ million people in this country voted for Donald Trump.
Right.
And to me, the biggest story that I hope, so if folks as a network we cover, is the cultural civil war in this country. I don't think it's going away regardless of who, and whether or not Trump eventually concedes. So to me, like, covering Trump feels secondary to the urgent need I feel as a network, whether that's, not necessarily the Washington desk, but the national team, whoever, to continue to sort of better understand what really feels to me like a cultural civil war in this country.
I 100% agree with you. I also think we have to interrogate our roles in this cultural civil war, and what we cover, how we cover it, how we cover communities, how we can be on the ground and understanding how we get to this place. It's also an interesting, I use I use interesting lightly, heavily, because I just use that as a placeholder, only to say our metabolism as news consumers has changed dramatically ever since the O.J. Simpson trial. Since then, we always want this 24-hour infusion of every little thing that's happening. And Trump is a master at being able to play into that. And so it is a real test, but also we have to be super present and understanding as things are happening on our roles in all of this, and what we've set as our mission to our audience as well. Which really gets us to maybe some of our last questions before we wrap up. As we move forward and continue to cover this transition of power and the new administration, we also have to address that over the past 4 years, people's trust in the government and the media has eroded significantly. So that really speaks to what I'm saying, too. It's the greatest obstacle that the Biden-Harris administration may actually face. And to that point, we have a question from Bill, who asks, how do we restore the public's confidence in government? Ron.
I'm not entirely sure that...
I get all the big questions for Ron, like the big existential questions.
Well, I'm not entirely sure it's our job to restore confidence in the government. I'm more concerned about re-inspiring confidence in the media. And by the media, let's take it one step at a time. Let's just make sure people maintain their trust in NPR. That's something I think we've all worked very hard to maintain. It's a hard-won reputation, but I think it's one that we can honestly take some pride in. Not just NPR, but all of our member stations and all of the journalists who have worked in this network over the years and are continuing to do so. And I must say, having been around for a while, a couple of decades in some, I must say that the crew at NPR today is as professional and as driven and as talented and as inspiring to work with as any there's ever been. So that's our first job, is to make sure that we maintain that. Second, I think, is to set a standard for others and say you can get an audience with this kind of journalism. And we need to assess how people feel about the media. We need to be critical of the media, but we need also to carry the message that media has something very important to offer to American life. And good news reporting is extraordinarily important to good political decisions being made by the body politic. If we can do that, and if we can portray government as something serious that has real responsibilities to the people and not just as a bunch of, funny people who play Punch and Judy on Capitol Hill, I think that kind of respect for the government on our part goes a fair distance to reestablishing that kind of faith and trust in the public at large.
Tam, any last words?
Well, I would say that it's not entirely on us, as Ron says, to reestablish faith in government. But I think that, as you point out, so many of our institutions have been degraded, and not just over the last 4 years, or it certainly has been a long process, aided and abetted by social media and any number of other things that tear us apart. But I mean, it's not just media, it's not just government, it's institutions like churches or other community institutions. And I just think that it is incredibly important as humans that we connect, albeit right now over Zoom, with other humans, and see people as people, and part of what we do at NPR is putting people's voices on the air so that people can see what people in other bubbles are up to. This is like one of those challenges that is going to be with us for a long time. And I think that, as Ron says, the best thing we can do is to put one foot in front of the other, not let ourselves become overwhelmed by the challenge, and just continue to do good work that we're proud of. And our audience pushes us to do better, and pushes us every day. And that's a good thing, because, it's not like we aren't already pushing ourselves pretty hard, but we push ourselves.
I know about, yes, NPR listeners definitely hold us up. Absolutely. Asma.
To that last question, to the last point, just to echo a bit of what both, I think, Tam and Ron have said, I think it is a big challenge to rebuild trust in media institutions as a whole. I say this as somebody who is from a very red state, who first got her first journalism job in a very red state. I came back from a reporting trip in October, and told my editor it has become significantly harder to talk to people than it was during the 2016 cycle and the 2018 cycle. And part of that is, people just don't want to engage sometimes with mainstream news outlets. It is a challenge. And I will say, I don't think it's a challenge, again, that's going to go away, which is partly why I think I'm sort of weirdly obsessed with this story of the fissures in the country, because I think it will be one of the biggest challenges for mainstream news outlets to maintain. I mean, it was the story of this weekend where not a single sitting Republican member of Congress wanted to go on any one of the Sunday talk shows. That's a problem. And I hope that it is a short-term problem that will be rectified. But in this moment, when you ask me right now, Tonya, I'm not particularly optimistic that it'll just get resolved by itself. I think it's going to take a lot of deep soul searching on behalf of all of us to figure out what to do.
Thank you all so much for this conversation, Asma Khalid, Tamara Keith, and Ron Elving. And let's go back to WBUR CEO Margaret Lowe for some last words.
You're muted.
Oh no, you're muted. Unmute.
It's 2020. Unmute.
2020. Unmute.
Oh dear.
Oh dear. Margaret is on mute. If we can get her off of mute within 5 seconds or 10 seconds.
Can you chat her?
Oh, she's back. I think she's back.
She's back. Yes.
Technology in 2020, this time is not for the faint of heart or the technologically challenged, I must say. Sorry about that. I just wanted to close by saying, Tonya, Asma, Ron, and Tam, thank you so much for your insights tonight, for your magnificent coverage. As you said, trust in media, quality reporting is critical for the country. We're going to continue to count on you in the weeks and months ahead as we watch the situation in Washington and across the country unfold. Thank you to everyone for joining us and for your trust in BUR and NPR. Your time is precious. We are so grateful you gave so much of it tonight. Enjoy the rest of the evening and the holiday ahead, whatever form it takes. Please, please be safe and be well. Thank you all so much.